Joining us now is Lew Weinstock, who leads the monitoring group at the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. Lew, thank you for joining us today. Lew, monitoring is such an important part of putting these new lead standards into action. Where are the new monitoring sites going to be required?
That's right, Allison. We're going to require monitoring around all lead sources where there's a potential to violate the lead NAAQS. At a minimum, we're going to require monitoring around lead sources that emit 1 ton or more of lead emissions. We call those our source-oriented sites because the monitors are going to be, in most cases, very close to the sources where the maximum concentration at the ground will be measured. In addition to that, we're going to have what we call non-source-oriented sites. Those sites are going to be required in all CBSAs, the core-based statistical areas, with a population of 500,000 or more people.
So urban areas with 500,000 people or more.
Those areas will be required to have at least one lead monitor, and again, all the sources of 1 ton or more will be required to have monitors. We call it a two-tier network design, the source-oriented monitors together with the non-source-oriented monitors. The rationale is to measure concentration around sources where we know it's likely to be high, but also to get an idea of what population exposure is around different sources likely to be found in urban areas.
Okay. Okay, so we've talked about source-oriented monitors and monitors in urban areas of 500,000 people or more. Once the monitors are put out there, who has to run them?
Like with all other monitors, they'll be run by the state and local agencies. Our monitoring requirements require them to meet these minimums for lead. But in addition, in some cases, tribes may wish to run monitors. Our monitoring requirements don't apply specifically to tribes, but we're certainly aware that in certain tribal areas there are important lead sources, and it will be a tribal option to go ahead and put monitors in, and we think that would be an important part of the network to supplement what we're requiring for the state and local agencies.
Lew, from your description of expanding the network, it sounds like we have a lot of work ahead of us. How did the current lead monitoring network get so small?
Well, it's actually logical if we think about the trend of lead emissions over time. 20 or more years ago, of course, there was lead in gasoline, and because of that, there was a lot of ambient emissions of lead that we had to measure. Because of that, at the time, the lead network was very extensive, and in fact was somewhere between 800 and 900 monitors. As we've gotten the lead emissions out of gasoline and the ambient levels have dropped, it was natural for EPA to work with the states to encourage that the lead network itself decreased down to something like 200 monitors now, or even less today. But this was a planned reduction. You know, it was always our strategy to work with the states to move monitoring resources to those pollutants that were most important, like ozone and fine particles, and away from those that, at least under the old NAAQS, weren't a problem. And in that respect, lead certainly was an eligible pollutant to reduce monitoring.
So with the new requirements, how many new monitoring sites do you anticipate that we are going to need?
Based on our look at the emissions inventory, we're estimating 140 of the source-oriented monitors that we talked about earlier. So there are at least 140 facilities with emissions of 1 ton or more where we will require states to put out these source-oriented monitors. In addition to that, we have those population-based CBSA requirements, and there are 101 of these metropolitan areas right now, are 500,000 or more based on the latest available census data. So the minimum required network is at approximately 140 source-oriented monitors, about 100 of the non-source monitors, for an overall new minimum network of 240 monitors.
Now, you said new network. Can some of the monitors be moved, or are these all new monitors?
Right. The numbers we talked about, 240, are new monitors. But even with the reduced network size that we have now, we're estimating that there are about 130 existing lead monitors. Of those, we think that about a third, maybe about 40, are in the right locations now to meet our new monitoring requirements, and therefore they could be then used to meet the new source-oriented or population-based requirements. In addition to that, we feel that there are about 90 monitors. They may not meet our new network design requirements, but because they're long-term monitors, they provide very valuable information. We would still encourage states to continue with those. So the overall size of the network, considering what we're requiring with the new network design and existing monitors, we're estimating at about 330 monitors.
Okay, so a mix of new monitors and existing monitors.
That's correct.
The rule sets out a minimum number of required monitoring sites. Could a state operate more sites if it wanted to?
Allison, states can always operate more monitors. We work together with the states and the regional offices to design networks that are best for each individual situation. We always view our minimum requirements just as what they are. Those are the smallest possible network to meet objectives, but we know that states and local agencies and tribes in some cases have particular problems that they want to investigate. And because of that, the ultimate network will be a combination of the minimum requirements and those discretionary monitors that states decide that they want to deploy.
You mentioned minimum requirements, but could a monitoring agency actually operate fewer monitors than our rules require?
In some cases, states can. There's a process that we've designed in the new rule to where if a state can demonstrate that the emissions from a source-oriented monitor will be less than half of the NAAQS, less than half of 0.15 micrograms per cubic meter, and they can do that through modeling or some other quantitative means, then the state can ask the EPA regional administrator to waive the monitoring requirement. At this time, we don't know how many states will ask for that, and we don't know how many of the sources might actually qualify. But in those limited situations, just states could theoretically have less than the minimum monitoring requirements.
From knowing what your emissions are from lead sources, how does a monitoring agency then demonstrate whether those emissions will contribute to a lead concentration in the outdoor air that is above 50% of the NAAQS?
Well, it has to be done by a quantitative means. The most common method we expect states to use is dispersion modeling, where they take the latest emission information from the source, they do either a screening or refined model, they look for the maximum concentration receptor around that source, and if that level then is less than half of the NAAQS, at least the state would have the option of asking for a monitoring waiver. It doesn't mean that states will want to do that for various reasons. They may want to have that monitor anyway. But we think it's important to work with states and local agencies to focus our monitoring resources where they're needed the most. So this was a flexibility option that we proposed, that we got favorable comment on, and that's why we included it in the final rule.
Sounds like there's a lot of work to do. When do the monitoring agencies actually have to get these sites up and running?
Well, we do know that there's a very tight timeline for this. The source-oriented monitors need to be deployed by January 1st, 2010. The non-source monitors a year later, January 1st, 2011. There's an annual monitoring network plan that's due 6 months before each of those deadlines. So if, for example, for the source-oriented monitors, July 1st, 2009, states will have to submit to their regions their plans for doing source-oriented monitoring. We're aware it's a tight deadline, but of course we want to get the monitors out as quickly as we can. We've tightened the standard by a factor of 10. It's certainly important to get the monitors now out in many places as we can to record those violations and then start working to cleaning up the air and cleaning up the facilities that are causing those violations.
You mentioned July 2009 as one of the first deadlines for monitoring plans. That's only about 8 months away. Is there anything monitoring agencies can be doing now to make sure that they meet these deadlines?
Definitely. Because that deadline is so soon, states really need to focus in on the source-oriented monitors. They need to go to their emission inventory or talk with their emission inventory people and identify all the sources in their area of 1 ton or more. Gather the information needed to do dispersion modeling, do that as quickly as they can to assess what the concentration on the ground is at someplace around the source. Those will be the candidate locations for the monitors. That information not only would be helpful for placing the monitors, but also if the state was thinking about requesting a waiver from the regional administrator, that would be information that would be needed to support the waiver request. I think states also should be evaluating their existing monitoring network now for lead. We mentioned earlier that there are at least 130 monitors out there now. It's quite likely that some of those will be in the correct places around sources. So states should be doing modeling, evaluating their sources, but at the same time looking at what they have in their network, determining which of the monitors can stay where they are, which of them can be candidates to be relocated. All that work done, even over the next few months, will really jumpstart the deployment of the network plan that's due to us in the regions by July 1st. And again, they've only got till January 1st, 2010 to actually get the sites relocated. So the sooner that we can collectively work on this, the more likely it is we're going to meet our own deadline.
So starting work now is key.
Absolutely.
Sorry, and are you all available to answer questions as agencies have them in putting these plans together?
We'll be working with states and with NACA and with the EPA regions to get as much information as we can out to the people actually evaluating sources, looking at new network site locations. Some of the guidance may be informal versus formal, so we can get the information out faster. But I think we all understand that there's a deadline approaching and we have to work as quickly as possible to achieve it.
We've talked about EPA assistance with developing plans, but let's ask the question that's on a lot of monitoring agencies' mind, and that's money. Is EPA going to be able to help monitoring agencies pay for this expanded network?
We definitely understand that there will be initial startup costs. We're talking with our senior managers now, both in Research Triangle Park and in Washington, to evaluate what the resources are within the existing '09 budget. Of course, we have to include conversations with the Office of Management and Budget, but I can assure everyone that there are high-level discussions going on, and as quickly as we can reach resolution, we're going to be talking with NACA, talking with the states about what our plans are for funding that network. Right now, our estimate is that the startup costs are about $4.5 million. That includes equipment, network design, platforms. That is the number we're working with, and as quickly as we can reach consensus, we will bring in the monitoring community and have conversations about how the funding will progress.
So we've talked a lot about the numbers of monitors, about the deadlines for getting monitors out. Let's turn now to monitoring methods, and let's talk about how you're going to measure lead. What methods should agencies be using to measure lead in the ambient air?
There's an existing federal reference method, what we call the FRM for lead, that's been around essentially for decades. It's the high volume TSP, total suspended particulate method for lead with atomic absorption. It's called TSP with AA. That's a method that's been around for years, and it will continue to be an acceptable method for lead. In fact, we expect at most of the source-oriented sites and probably some of the non-source-oriented sites that the high-volume TSP method will be the method of choice for states.
Earlier, Deirdre Murphy told us that in certain circumstances, agencies could use lead in PM10 data to demonstrate compliance with the new standards. What methods can monitoring agencies use to measure lead in PM10?
In this rulemaking, we finalized a new federal reference method for lead using XRF, X-ray fluorescence. We know that states have been interested, as well as our science advisors, KSAC, in providing a PM10 option for measuring lead. The rule sets out several opportunities where states could propose that PM10 be used. It's important for states to look at the rule and to have conversations with their regional administrator, because presumptively lead in TSP will be the method of choice. But particularly in the non-source-oriented method, in the non-source-oriented monitoring network, if states can demonstrate quantitatively that their ambient levels of lead will be less than 0.10 micrograms per cubic meter or less, then they will have the opportunity to request that lead in PM10 be used. The question is, why would they want to do that? Well, lead in PM10 uses a filter and methodology that's very consistent with what we use now for PM2.5. So there's certainly some consistency in terms of logistics and methods that states may find attractive.
Are there any other changes to the monitoring requirements that agencies should be aware of?
There's some changes, of course, to quality assurance now that we have new methodologies for lead, and we've actually taken the first comprehensive review of monitoring regs in almost 30 years for some aspects of lead monitoring. We've revised quality assurance. We've revised the procedures for which we can approve federal equivalent methods, FEMs for lead, particularly for lead in PM10. So those are important parts of the rule that I encourage everyone to read. But I think the big picture is what we've already talked about: the network design, the methods, the deployment schedule. Those are the key things I think we initially need to focus in on, but of course we'll provide support to states for understanding what the method options are and the QA options are as well.
Lew, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about requirements for new monitors, a lot of upcoming deadlines, and monitoring methods. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Because of the deadline for deploying these monitors, I think it's essential that we all communicate as much as possible. States need to look at the material, of course, that EPA provides, but there need to be discussions between states and the EPA regional contacts, and of course here at headquarters, to make sure that information is flowing in both directions. We really need the eyes and ears on the ground out at the state level right now, assessing their networks, assessing those one-ton sources we talked about, looking at which of the CBSAs are 500,000 or more in population. There's really no reason right now where states can't do a lot of the legwork and get ready for that July 1st, 2009 network plan submittal date that we talked about. It's a quick deadline, but I think if we all work together, we can really make it happen.
Thank you, Lew, for joining us today.
Thank you, Allison.